Welcome back. Is democracy alive and well and thriving, or are we witnessing its gradual downfall around the world? Joining me to discuss the future of popular government, I'm joined from London by John Keane, founder of the Centre for the Study of Democracy and a fellow at the influential London-based think tank, the Institute for Public Policy Research. He's authored several books on democracy, and his latest, The Life and Death of Democracy, was published last month. Here in Washington, D.C., I'm joined by Ted Danier, Africa Specialist at the Congressional Research Service. He also served as a special advisor to President Clinton's Special Envoy for Sudan and also to the Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Susan Rice. Now, before we get back to our discussion, let's take a look at the results of that chatroom poll. Before the break, we asked, should democracy be enforced at any cost? 26% of you in the chat room said yes, while 74% of you said no. Of course, we have to remember these numbers are not scientific, but a good indication of what people in our chat room are thinking. As we get back to our discussion, Professor Keane, if I could put a question we got from our chat room to you from Jeff in the USA, who says, we in the USA do not enjoy democracy. We suffer in a capitalocracy, where money will buy freedom. Just make sure your source of capital never dries up. Any comments on that?
Bit too simple, but I can see what the commentator is trying to say, which is that when a society, a market society, has very considerable inequalities of wealth, that violates the norm, the rule of democracy, that there should be equal power sharing. That's true. But I would also say that something distinctive about democracy since its birth actually before the Greeks, is that it stimulates people's expectations, their hopes of an equalization of power, and it most often disappoints them. So one of the qualities of a democracy, if I may say, in its defense, is that grumbling is normal. And democracies are never better when actually there is grumbling about the lack of resources, of the inequalities of power, and the institutions that don't properly function. At that point, with a bit of luck and under some special circumstances, democracies can be democratized. And certainly that's one of the big political projects, I think, facing the Obama administration.
We've got on the line from Switzerland, Isa. Thanks for joining us from there. Isa, what would you like to ask?
Actually, it's not a question, it's a comment.
Okay.
I think the root cause of lack of democracy in Africa, and also the root cause of failed states, is related to three components. One is the legacy of the colonialism,
okay,
and the Cold War and the post-Cold War. For example, I can cite an example, my country, Somalia. Somalia is a homogeneous nation. And its impact, the colonialism has impacted. They have divided the country into 5 parts. During the Cold War, there was a revival.
Okay, Isa, what, because of our lack of time, were there any other, were those the 3 factors you were discussing?
No, what I'm saying is the 3 factors are the main cause which I mean has impacted on Africa due to lack of democracy and also of the collapsed states in some of African countries.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Isa. Let me put to Ted Danier to response to Isa's comment. How much of that colonial era is responsible for the legacy, you feel?
I think to a certain extent it did contribute. If you take Somalia as the example given, you had one part of Somalia colonized by the British and the other by the Italians, and of course at independence they were united. But I think it would be wrong to suggest that the outside factor contributed to lack of democracy in Africa. I think it's the poor leadership, and it's the the fact of the matter is that African governments, when they come to power, they came to power either through military coup or through forceful measures. And that has changed beginning in the 1990s, and I think it's important to acknowledge those changes came not as a result of outside pressure, but as a result of pressure from within.
Let me ask you, Ted, then the issue of somewhere like Niger, where you have Mamadou Tanja saying he wants to extend. We're seeing this not just in Niger, of course, we're seeing it in Honduras as well. What happens when you have a leader who's reluctant to give up power then? What happens to the people and their expectations?
We've had several other attempts made in the past few years, Nigeria being one of them, but it didn't go through. Niger, I think, would attempt to go forward with the the hope that he would stay in power. I would imagine, I think, that the pressure from outside and the pressure from within eventually would lead to restoring democracy rather than pushing Niger to move in the other direction.
Okay, let's get Shaukat on the line, who's joined us on the phone. Shaukat?
Yeah, hello, yeah. I'd like to say I personally endorse democracy because it brings accountability and gives power to the people. But the problem I have, what kind of message does it send from the West when they encourage democracy and then do not respect groups like Hamas who win the election in Palestine?
Professor Keane, that's an interesting point. A lot of people say the West has very flexible standards or flexible rules when it comes to democracy if it doesn't suit the interests of the West.
Well, we're back to the problem of hypocrisy again, and it's one of the acids that can eat away support for democracy, and therefore democracies in our 21st century context need to pay attention to their own houses. They need to get their houses in order. Torture, abuse of rights, the violation of parliamentary scrutiny. I mean, these kinds of failures within actually existing democracies need to be remedied urgently. That's why the present crisis of the Westminster model in Britain, or the Bush administration's championing of torture, were so embarrassing and actually unproductive for the cause of democracy. May I just add one other factor that perhaps throws some light also on Ted Danye's very interesting comments, which is that democracies historically have survived and thrived. They've been nurtured best when they occur in a cluster. That is, when there is a kind of regional settlement, some kind of regional relaxation of anti-democratic pressures, above all war. I think one could say lots about the African context and the relative weakness of regional democratic settlements until relatively recently. But I think, and at the opposite end, I think American policy, for example, in the Middle East, the unconditional championing of Israel, has actually been negative it's had very deleterious effects on democracy, and I think the ransacking of the Hamas government is a case in point. The best example we have in the 21st century, I think, is the example of European integration, where the Copenhagen criteria, as they're called, are applied to all member states and all future states. It's having democratic effects within Turkey, and it has actually rescued some states in Central Eastern Europe from the kinds of fates that they suffered during the 1920s and 30s. So regionalization of democracy is very, very important.
Tedania, your thoughts on that, and perhaps how also technology, which is informing the masses far more quickly and more effectively, may also be helping to improve the lot of the average person in terms of demanding accountability.
I think, it's important. Let me go back to the question that was raised earlier as it relates to Africa. Here you have in the Sudan, elections are expected after the end of the interim period next year. And the current president, President Omar Bashir, is expected to run. Suppose he wins, and he's the same man who's accused by the International Criminal Court of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, you may have a transparent democracy, yet you have the issue of justice. Do you embrace a leader with that kind of a human rights record? As use of technology, I think it has actually helped in Africa significantly. I'll give you an example. During the national elections in Ethiopia, most of the communication done when the crackdown began by the government was actually by text messaging, coordinating demonstrations and so forth. The government at the end figured out what happened and they shut it down. So you'll find this kind of activities through the internet, text messaging and so forth to promote and to inform.
Professor Keane, looking at on that very thought that Ted Dania brings up, the use of technology, Iran, of course, we've seen something in Iran in terms of bypassing the government restrictions and people communicating with each other through new media.
Well, I think that the case of Iran is a cutting-edge example of two contradictory trends. in the field of democracy in this early part of the 21st century. On the one hand, there are attempts in various contexts around the world by leaders using state regimes to reinforce and to concentrate their power, ultimately through terror and violence, but through appealing to the people, presenting themselves as servants of the people. What could be more democratic than that? On the other hand, is the trend found within the opposition in Iran, clustered around Mr. Mousavi, using all of this new galaxy of internet-based communication to call for the deconcentration of power, the respect for rights, the promotion of civil society, the development of what I've called in my Life and Death of Democracy, monitory democracy, a new kind of democracy which entails not only fair and free elections, but also the permanent scrutiny, public scrutiny of power wherever
Professor?
it is exercised. I think Iran is a cutting-edge example of this contradictory trend.
Well, Professor, I have to thank you. Unfortunately, such a fascinating subject, and we're out of time. Thank you very much. And Ted Dania, thank you too.
It's a pleasure.
My pleasure.
Good to have you both here. Now, thank you for being with us. On the next show, just hours before polls open in Indonesia, the world's most populous Muslim country, can President Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono deliver on his promises of reform if he's given a second term? Remember, you can join us on Twitter at the address below, twitter.com/AJ Riz Khan. From me and the team, see you next time.